3 times the budget of schools and universities combined. That was what the Emperor of Nilfgaard spent hunting one girl. Not armies, not territories, not the consolidation of conquered kingdoms, or the maintenance of roads that stretched from the Emhyr Mountains to the edges of the known world. One child, ashen hair, green eyes, his daughter. The intelligence apparatus consumed resources that could have built libraries in every province, could have funded academies of magic, could have erected monuments that would stand for centuries. Instead, servants were recruited in Redanian taverns, merchants were cultivated in Kedweni markets, minor nobles throughout the north found themselves with unexpected debts forgiven, with favorable contracts granted, with promotions that arrived without explanation. Each became a thread in a web that existed for a single purpose: to locate Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon and deliver her to the man who had ordered the graves of his enemies opened so their tombstones could pave his ballroom floor. The North called him Monster. They were not entirely wrong, but monsters were simpler than what Emhyr var Emreis had become. Monsters did not calculate. They did not plan across decades. They did not build empires as mechanisms to serve obsessions that could never be spoken aloud. What created such a man began decades before, in a room where they made a 13-year-old boy scream. The ballroom floor bore names, not carved into marble, not engraved as memorial. The stones themselves had been tombstones once, pulled from graves that ringed the capital. Each slab marked where an enemy had been laid, where families had wept, where earth had accepted what power discarded. Now those same stones formed the floor of the imperial palace at Nilfgaard. When the emperor danced, he danced upon them. When courtiers processed through the grand hall in their silk and their certainty, their footsteps wore smooth the names of the dead. They called him Ithlinne Adden Incarn Ep Morvud. In the elder speech, the tongue that had ruled these lands before humans came, the title meant something precise: the white flame, dancing on the Barrows of His Enemies. Not a metaphor. The man who held absolute power over half the known world had taken that phrase and made it architecture. He had rendered it literal. Where others spoke of dancing on graves as flourish, as poetry, he had ordered the graves opened and the markers brought. He walked over them daily. Some said this was madness. Others said it was message. The truth existed in the space between. Emhyr var Emreis understood that power built itself on what others remembered. Fear lived longest in the bones, in the small adjustments people made without thinking. A courtier who entered that ballroom and glanced down, who saw the weathered inscriptions beneath centuries of polished use, learned something. The lesson did not require words. The stones taught it. Those who stood against the Imperator didn't rest in honored ground. They didn't keep their peace. Even in death, they served his purpose, bearing weight they never chose. This was the man the northern kingdoms feared more than winter. The empire stretched from the Emhyr Mountains to territories whose names changed with each campaign. Nilfgaard proper, yes, but also Matina and Ebbing, Gemera and Vicovaro, Nazaire and lands the north, called occupied, and Nilfgaard termed integrated. The bureaucracy that governed this expanse had developed a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Roads appeared where armies needed them. Grain moved from surplus provinces to deficit ones with suspicious speed. The tax collectors arrived on schedule. The emperor's spies consumed 3 times what the state spent on education, culture, and arts combined. Someone had compiled those numbers. Someone always did, in Nilfgaard. At the center of this machinery sat a man whose face rarely shifted. Those who stood before Emhyr var Emreis in audience found themselves facing something carved. He did not raise his voice. Courtiers whispered about this, how the Imperator could condemn a man to death without his tone changing, without anger creeping into the syllables. He spoke as he governed, with precision that made the heat irrelevant. Emotion suggested chaos. Chaos suggested weakness. The emperor permitted neither. Nordlings, those who lived in the kingdoms north of the mountains, told different stories about him. In their taverns, in their markets, the tales grew elaborate. Some claimed he bathed in blood. Others insisted he was no longer fully human, that the mages who served him had remade him into something that could not die. Mothers threatened children with him. If you don't sleep, the white flame will come. If you don't obey, Nilfgaard will take you. The name became interchangeable with doom. The reality proved simpler and perhaps more frightening. He was a man who had learned what sacrifice meant before most boys understood the word. He was a man who had been 13 years old when his world collapsed, who had watched from a place beyond screaming while those who wanted his father's cooperation demonstrated what they would do to sons. He was a man who had lived as a monster, who had walked in a body that made peasants reach for pitchforks and nobles reach for swords. He was a man who understood that love could break curses and that prophecy could corrupt kingdoms. He was a man who had killed his wife and hunted his daughter. He was, in all the ways that mattered to history, the most dangerous person of his age. Yet those who served him closely, not the frightened courtiers, but the ones who stood near enough to see the details, noticed small things, how he never forgot a name, how he chose his advisors from among the capable rather than the noble-born, how he crushed plots against him not through purges but through precision, removing the architects and sparing the misled. Some interpreted this as strategy. Others wondered if remnants of the boy who had been tortured persisted beneath the emperor's mask. Perhaps both were true. The wars he launched against the north came at great cost. Nilfgaardian mothers buried sons. Nilfgaardian fathers returned with limbs missing. The treasury that should have funded schools and roads instead funded armor and arrows. Nobles who had grown comfortable in peace found themselves taxed to support campaigns that dragged through seasons. The common people, who gained nothing from conquest, watched their emperor spend their labor on expansion that benefited the aristocracy. Resentment grew in the places power forgot to watch. But Emhyr var Emreis was not building an empire for love of territory. Maps were means. Borders were tools. Everything he did served a purpose that he shared with almost no one. Advisors who pressed for explanation received silence. Even those closest to the throne learned not to ask why Sintra specifically, why the search for one girl consumed such resources, why the intelligence network spent itself hunting a single child. The answer existed. The answer was monstrous. The answer was something he could never speak aloud without destroying the loyalty he needed. So he governed in silence. He made decisions that moved armies. He approved strategies that starved cities. He read reports about a girl with ashen hair and green eyes, a girl who could tear holes in reality, a girl who carried in her blood the power to reshape the world. He read those reports and gave orders and never explained why a father would hunt his daughter with such dedication. In the north, bards sang about him, not in admiration. Their ballads cast him as the villain of the age, the darkness spreading from the south. They were not entirely wrong, but they simplified. They made him uncomplicated evil, and that was a comfortable lie. Evil that pure did not exist. What walked in human skin was always more complex, always more difficult to oppose because it believed itself justified. Emhyr var Emreis believed he was saving the world. The Prophecy of Ithlinne had shown him a future where the elder blood, combined with imperial power, produced a child who would rule not half the world, but all of it. A child who could stand against the threat that rode behind winter winds, the cavalcade of dead things that the credulous called the Wild Hunt. Emhyr had listened to that prophecy and made his calculations. The math was simple. One girl's freedom, weighed against the survival of civilization. One father's love, measured against the fate of millions. He had done the arithmetic. He had reached his conclusion. Everything that followed came from that. The ballroom stones said nothing about this. The names beneath the polish belonged to men who had opposed him for power, for pride, for politics. They had been enemies he could defeat with armies and strategy. The true complexity lived elsewhere, in decisions he had made in darkness, in a woman, falling into the sea, in orders given to knights whose loyalty exceeded their understanding. Historians would write about him. That much was certain. Whether they called him monster or visionary would depend on what followed, on whether his plan succeeded or collapsed. He had gambled everything on a future that required his daughter to become his wife, required a child born of incest to inherit power that could remake reality. If that future arrived, they might forgive him. If it failed, they would curse his name for generations. He did not appear to care which judgment came. He sat in his capital, behind walls that had never fallen, and moved his empire like a player moving pieces. He read reports. He gave orders. He didn't smile. He did not weep. He had learned, in a room where they tortured him at 13, that revealing pain only encouraged those who inflicted it. The lesson had taken root. He had become someone who could not be hurt because he no longer showed what hurt meant. This was the legacy of the boy who burned. This was the empire built on silence. This was the man who danced on graves and called it governance, who launched wars and called it destiny. who destroyed his own family and called it necessary. The North feared him for good reason, but fear was incomplete understanding. To comprehend what Emhyr var Emreis had become required looking back, required tracing the path from the palace to the torture chamber, from the emperor to the cursed boy, from the white flame to the hedgehog who had once believed in love. The stones in the ballroom remembered some of this. The names worn smooth by countless footsteps spoke of consequences, but the full story lived in places no tombstone marked, in a ship that sank with one body in its wake, in a girl running through forests and cities while her father's hunters followed, in decisions made in darkness that would light or extinguish the future. Emhyr var Emreis had become the axis on which the continent turned. Kings adjusted their strategies around him. Generals planned campaigns with his forces as the central variable. Peasants prayed for his armies to turn elsewhere. He had achieved what few rulers managed. His existence changed how others lived, regardless of distance, regardless of allegiance. Whether this made him great or terrible remained a question without easy answer. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps those categories proved insufficient for understanding a man who had survived what should have destroyed him, who had chosen ambition over humanity, who had looked at prophecy and decided he would be the one to force its truth. The ballroom floor bore names. The emperor walked over them without glancing down. He had danced this dance before. He knew every step. The music that played in that hall came from decisions made decades ago, from a coup that had tried to break a family, from a curse that had tried to break a boy. It had not worked, or perhaps it had worked too well. Perhaps what emerged from that breaking was more dangerous than what had gone in. The North would learn this, the world would learn this, and by the time understanding arrived, it would already be too late. Before there was an emperor, there was a child. The biographers who wrote the official histories preserved fragments. A boy with dark hair, a boy who laughed easily, a boy who followed his father through the palace corridors, asking questions that made the Emperor Fergus var Emreis smile. The records described him as bright, as curious, as the sort of child who collected facts the way other children collected stones. He wanted to understand how things worked, the empire, the armies, the bureaucracy that turned decisions into action. His father indulged this. Fergus believed his son would need such knowledge. The throne waited. Understanding should arrive before it did. This was in the years when Nilfgaard was stable. Not peaceful. Empires were never truly peaceful, but functional. The succession was clear. Fergus had proven himself capable. The aristocracy had accepted him. The mechanisms of power operated smoothly enough that most citizens never thought about them. This was the world young Emhyr grew into, a world where his future was certain, where the path from childhood to crown was simply a matter of time and preparation. That world ended when he was 13. Coup did not announce themselves. They built in shadows, in conversations held where informants could not hear, in alliances formed through careful negotiation. The conspirators who moved against Fergus var Emreis had planned for months, possibly years. They had identified which generals could be bought, which ministers could be frightened, which portions of the bureaucracy would accept new authority if it arrived with sufficient force. They had done their preparation. When they moved decisively. The palace fell in a night. Imperial guards who had sworn loyalty to Fergus found themselves facing a choice: die for an emperor who had already lost, or live by accepting the new order. Most chose survival. This was not cowardice. It was recognition. The coup had succeeded in its essential goal. Fergus var Emreis no longer controlled the mechanisms of state. Whether he lived or died was now someone else's decision. The conspirators chose to keep him alive. This proved their first miscalculation. They needed legitimacy. A coup that simply murdered the sitting emperor would face resistance from portions of the empire that valued law over expedience. But an emperor who acknowledged the new regime, who granted it his blessing, who transferred power voluntarily, that would solve many problems. So they kept Fergus alive and began the work of persuasion. He refused. This was not unexpected. They had prepared for resistance. They had tools for dealing with it. They brought Emhyr into the room. What occurred in that room was documented only through inference and fragments. Official records did not preserve details. Perhaps this was mercy. Perhaps it was shame. What is known is this: the conspirators believed they could break Fergus's will by demonstrating what refusal would cost. They believed a father who watched his son suffer would eventually relent. They believed pain had limits that strategy could exploit. They brought in a mage named Brothens. They gave him instructions. They told him to make the boy scream. Brothens was efficient. The work took hours. Accounts differ on whether Fergus spoke during this time, whether he begged them to stop, whether he offered anything in exchange for his son's safety. What is certain is that he did not give the conspirators what they wanted. He did not legitimize them. He watched his son suffer and remained unmoved in the only way that mattered. He did not break. This was the second miscalculation. A man who could endure that could not be persuaded. The conspirators recognized this eventually. The torture continued past the point where it served their purpose. It became something else. Punishment for resistance, demonstration of power, cruelty for its own sake, dressed in political necessity. When they finally stopped, when they removed young Emhyr from that room, Brothens added a final element. The usurper, this was how he would be known in histories that Emhyr would later commission, decided that if Fergus could not be broken, he could at least be punished in ways that would persist. He ordered the mage to curse the boy. The curse was carefully designed. Brothens had a sense of irony that would cost him his life years later. He transformed Emhyr into something between human and beast. The shape that emerged resembled a hedgehog, covered in bristles, with a snout that made speech difficult, and features that made showing emotion impossible. The mage chose this form deliberately. In the elder speech, the word for hedgehog was Emhyr, similar enough to Emhyr's name that the joke was obvious to anyone who understood the language. The usurper's court found this amusing. The boy had been made into a pun, but the curse had another layer. It was not permanent during daylight. From dawn until midnight, Emhyr existed as the beast. From midnight until dawn, he returned to human form. This meant he would remember. He would spend his nights as himself, knowing what waited with sunrise. He would feel the transformation repeatedly, would experience the moment when his body stopped being his own. The curse was designed to be survived. It was also designed to ensure that survival meant continuous suffering. They released him into the wilderness shortly after. Fergus var Emreis was assassinated. The usurper had tired of keeping him alive, and his cursed son was set loose with the hunters on his trail. The conspirators assumed the boy would be caught quickly. A 13-year-old, even one transformed into a monster, could not evade trained men for long. They were mistaken. Emhyr survived. How? He did this became the subject of speculation and legend. The official biographies Emhyr would later commission avoided the topic almost entirely. A few scattered accounts suggested he learned to move at night, to find shelter before dawn, to avoid settlements where his monstrous form would draw attention. One report, possibly false, claimed he fell in with a knight-errant, a madman who tilted at windmills and saw in the cursed boy a companion rather than a monster. Whether this was true or invention remained unclear. Emhyr never confirmed it. He never denied it. The years between his escape and his reappearance existed in shadow. What could be confirmed was this: the curse did not break his mind. The torture had not destroyed his capacity to think. Whatever happened in that room, whatever Brothens had done to him, it had not achieved what the conspirators intended. They had wanted to create a broken thing, something that could be discarded or displayed as warning. Instead, they had created someone who understood exactly how cruelty functioned, who had learned its mechanics from the inside, who knew what people were capable of when they believed power permitted anything. This was the education that would shape an emperor. During the daylight hours when the curse held him in beast form, Emhyr could not speak. He could not explain himself. Anyone who saw him saw a monster. Peasants reached for weapons. Nobles reached for hunters. The reaction was always the same. His appearance determined how he was treated. The content of his character, his thoughts, his humanity, none of it mattered against what his body had become. He learned this lesson daily. Appearance was reality. What people saw was what they believed. At night, in the hours when the curse released him, he planned. 13 was young to be thinking about revenge, but Emhyr was no longer a child in the ways that mattered. Pain had a way of accelerating maturity. Torture taught lessons that childhood games never approached. He thought about the usurper. He thought about Brothens. He thought about the men who had held him while the mage worked. He thought about his father, who had refused to break even when breaking would have ended the suffering. That refusal meant something. Fergus had chosen principle over his son's immediate safety. Whether this was noble or monstrous, Emhyr did not yet know. He would spend years attempting to understand that choice. In the moment, he knew only that his father had believed some things mattered more than pain, more than family, more than survival. The boy who emerged from those years was not the boy who had entered that room. The transformation ran deeper than the curse. Something fundamental had changed. The child who had collected facts and asked questions had learned that knowledge was insufficient. Power was what mattered. Understanding how systems worked meant nothing if you could not control them. His father had understood Nilfgaard perfectly. His father was dead anyway. This was perhaps the cruelest lesson. Competence was not protection. Being right did not save you. The usurper was less intelligent than Fergus, less capable, less suited to rule. None of that had prevented the coup. None of that had saved the rightful emperor. Force had triumphed, and now force was what the throne rested on, what the empire recognized. The usurper ruled because he had been willing to do what Fergus would not, to kill, to torture, to discard law when law proved inconvenient. Emhyr learned. He learned thoroughly. The years in exile taught him other things: how to survive on limited resources, how to move unseen, how to distinguish between threats that required avoidance and threats that could be endured. He learned which people might help a monster and which would kill one without hesitation. He learned to read situations quickly, to make decisions with incomplete information, to accept risk when risk was all that remained. He also learned about destiny. The law of surprise was ancient custom in the north, older than the kingdoms that currently filled those lands. It operated on a principle that most found mystical, that fate could be invoked, that promising something you did not yet possess could bind the future. Emhyr, desperate for any advantage, any tool that might shift probability in his direction, began studying this law. He read what texts he could find. He questioned those who knew the traditions. He learned how the law worked, and, more importantly, when it could be used. The opportunity came in Cintra. King Rugnar, traveling through the forest, encountered what appeared to be bandits. What occurred next existed in several versions. Some claimed Emhyr, still cursed, still in beast form during daylight, fought the bandits off. Others suggested he warned the king in time to escape. The details varied. The outcome did not. Rugnar survived when he should have died, and when he offered reward, Emhyr invoked the law of surprise. What you find at home that you don't expect. The ancient formula. Rugnar agreed, likely thinking the payment would be a new dog or an unexpected visitor. He returned to Cintra and discovered his wife was pregnant. The child, not yet born, now belonged to the Urkion who had saved the king's life. Emhyr had bound his future to Cintra's royal line. Whether this was strategy or accident, calculation or opportunism, he never clarified. But it gave him something, a claim that could not be easily dismissed, a connection to power that persisted even while he remained a monster. He did not immediately invoke that claim. 15 years passed. During that time, the curse continued. During that time, he remained in exile. He watched the usurper consolidate power in Nilfgaard. He watched his father's legacy be systematically erased. He waited. This was another lesson learned in pain. That timing mattered more than righteousness. He could have stormed back to Nilfgaard immediately, could have attempted to rally loyalists, could have tried to reclaim his birthright through force. He would have failed. The usurper was too entrenched. The aristocracy had accepted the new order. Fighting that immediately would have meant dying heroically and uselessly. So he waited. He survived. He let the curse shape him in ways the conspirators had not intended. They had wanted to make him monstrous in body. They succeeded. But in doing so, they had also made him dangerous in ways they had not anticipated. A boy who grew up as a prince learned privilege. A boy who grew up as a hunted beast learned necessity. The second education was more useful for someone who intended to rule. During those years, he also learned what love felt like. The official histories were vague on this, but fragments suggested he met Pavetta before he formally claimed her, that they had time together in secret, that the Princess of Cintra knew the man beneath the curse before she learned his true identity. Whether this was genuine affection or strategic cultivation remained debated. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps they became true at different times. What is certain is that when he finally appeared at Pavetta's 15th birthday celebration, when he announced his claim via the law of surprise, he did so knowing the curse could be broken. Love was the mechanism. Not just any love, true love, whatever that meant. The old magics operated on such terms. They required genuine feeling, something that could not be faked or forced. If Pavetta loved him, if that love was real, the curse would end. The night of that banquet, after the fighting and the negotiations and the chaos that Pavetta's own power unleashed, the curse did break. Midnight arrived. Emhyr transformed back to human form. This time, he didn't revert at dawn. The spell was finished. He stood before the court as himself, as the man he had been during the handful of hours each night when the curse released him. He was free. In that moment, it must have seemed like redemption. The years of suffering had led somewhere. The boy who had been tortured and cursed and exiled had survived long enough to break free. He had a wife who loved him. He had a place in Cintra's court. He had escaped the usurper's reach. For a time, months, possibly years, he lived something resembling a normal life. Then prophecy arrived. Then Vilgefortz appeared with his visions and his promises. Then Emhyr learned what his daughter represented, what power she carried, what future she might shape. And then the man who had been tortured at 13, who had lived as a beast, who had survived through calculation and will, had to make a choice. The choice he made would define everything that followed. It would transform him from victim to architect of suffering. It would take the lessons he had learned in that room, the understanding of how cruelty functioned, and apply them to his own family. He would become the thing he had endured, but not yet. For a brief time, he was simply Duny. Husband to Pavetta, father to Ciri, a man with a monstrous past who had found something resembling peace. That peace would not last. It was not built to last. The boy who burned in that torture chamber had been prepared for something else entirely. The law of surprise was not magic, though it touched magic. It was older than spells, older than the first human kingdoms on the continent. Gnomes had known it. Dwarves practiced it. Elves acknowledged its binding power. When humans arrived, they found the custom waiting, woven into the fabric of how the world responded to intention. Some called it destiny. Others called it contract. Both were partially correct. The mechanism was simple. Someone saved another's life. The saved person, unable to provide adequate payment, promised instead what you find at home that you don't expect. The formula was precise because precision mattered. The gift had to be unexpected. It had to already exist, waiting unknown. A child not yet announced. A treasure not yet discovered. Something real but unrevealed. Once spoken, the promise bound. Not through law that courts could enforce. Through something deeper. The world itself seemed to notice such promises. Coincidence arranged itself around them. People found themselves drawn together by chains they could not see. Those who tried to break such bonds discovered that circumstance conspired against them. The law of surprise was not mere custom. It was architecture built into how events occurred. Emhyr had invoked this when he saved Regner. Whether he knew Pavetta existed as an unannounced pregnancy, whether he calculated this or stumbled into it, remained uncertain. What mattered was the binding. The princess born after that promise belonged to him in ways that transcended ownership. She was his by right of destiny, by the world's own acknowledgement of what he was owed. But destiny provided no instruction manual. It created connections. What happened within those connections was still choice. Emhyr, still calling himself Duny, still hiding his true name, didn't immediately claim Pavetta. He had 15 years. The law of surprise specified no timeline. The bond would persist regardless. He could have waited until she was older, until she'd grown into whatever she would become. Instead, he began visiting Cintra, not openly, not as the Urkion who had saved the king, as something else, a figure glimpsed in gardens, a presence at the edges of court functions. He watched her. Pavetta was not what he expected. Royal daughters in that era were often decorative. They learned music and embroidery, learned to manage households, learned to be beautiful and useful in ways that benefited their family's political ambitions. Pavetta had learned these things, but she had also inherited something else: power. The same source magic that would later manifest in Ciri ran in Pavetta's blood. It made her dangerous in ways that proper princesses were not supposed to be. She was also lonely. Calanthe, her mother, was the lioness of Cintra, a queen who ruled through strength and strategy. Pavetta's father was dead. She existed in a court that prepared her for marriage as though she were a piece on a game board, someone to be moved, to be positioned, to be sacrificed if the game required it. This was not cruelty. This was how kingdoms functioned. Daughters were alliances. Love was irrelevant. Pavetta wanted something else. When Duny finally approached her, when he found her reading poetry in a garden, when he spoke to her rather than simply watching, she responded. Not because he was handsome. The curse ensured he was not, at least not during daylight hours, but because he treated her as though her thoughts mattered, because he listened, because in the brief hours between midnight and dawn, when the curse released him and he could show his true face, he was something she had not encountered before, honest about his strangeness. They began meeting regularly, always after midnight, always in secret. The poetry became conversations. The conversations became confessions. She told him about the pressure of being Calanthe's daughter, about knowing she would be married to whoever served Cintra's interests best. He told her about the curse, about being something monstrous during the day, about not knowing if the transformation would ever end. They built something between them, whether it was love or whether it was two lonely people finding each other in the dark. The distinction perhaps did not matter. They were careful. Servants were bribed or avoided. Calanthe had informants throughout the palace, but even the lioness could not watch everywhere simultaneously. For nearly a year, Pavetta and Duny met in shadows. For nearly a year, they believed their secret was safe. Calanthe discovered them. Exactly how remained unclear. Perhaps a servant's loyalty broke. Perhaps one of her informants noticed the pattern. Perhaps a mother simply recognized the signs in her daughter's behavior. However it occurred, Calanthe learned that something was visiting Pavetta at night, something that was not supposed to be there. The lioness did not tolerate threats to her family. She brought in a witcher. Not Geralt of Rivia, that came later, but someone else. Someone whose name did not survive in the accounts. The instructions were clear. Find the creature meeting with the princess. Kill it. Protect Pavetta from whatever predator had found its way into the palace. Duny learned of this. He had his own informants, his own ways of knowing. He could have fled. The smart move was to disappear, to abandon the relationship, to invoke the law of surprise when Pavetta was older and the danger had passed. He didn't flee. Instead, he decided to accelerate his plans. If Calanthe was moving against him, he would force the confrontation on terms that benefited him. The law of surprise was public record. King Ragnar had acknowledged it before witnesses. If Duny could reach Pavetta's 15th birthday celebration, the banquet where she was to be formally presented and her betrothal announced, he could invoke his claim in a setting where Calanthe could not simply have him killed without consequence. It was a gamble. It required believing that law mattered more than a queen's convenience. It required trusting that Calanthe, for all her ruthlessness, would honor her deceased husband's promises. It required being willing to stand before the assembled nobility of Cintra and reveal what he was. The banquet occurred in 1252. Pavetta was 15. Calanthe had arranged for her to be married to Crach and Crate of Skellige, a solid alliance, a man who would bring ships and warriors to Cintra's defense. The celebration was elaborate. Lords and their retinues filled the hall. Geralt of Rivia was present, hired for reasons that only became clear later. Everything was arranged. Everything was proceeding according to Calanthe's design. Then Duny arrived. He came in armor, his face concealed behind a helmet. When Ice Twirsek knocked that helmet away, revealing the bristled snout and monstrous features beneath, the hall erupted. This was not just a cursed man. This was a creature claiming the princess via ancient law. Calanthe demanded he be killed. Guards moved forward. The situation balanced on the edge of violence. Duny explained the law of surprise. He cited Ragnar's promise. He argued his case before the assembled court. And crucially, Pavetta recognized him. Not just his voice, not just his presence. She knew him. Whatever they had built during those midnight meetings proved stronger than the shock of his daylight appearance. She declared she loved him. She said she would honor her father's promise. Calanthe refused. She ordered Geralt to kill Duny. Geralt, for his own reasons, declined. The queen ordered her guards to attack. Duny fought. Geralt, caught in the middle, ended up defending him. The hall descended into chaos. And then Pavetta's power manifested. The source within her responded to her distress, to her fear for Duny's life, to the violence threatening everything she wanted. Magic erupted, not controlled, not trained. Raw force that threw furniture and men across the hall. That shattered windows. That made the stone itself groan. Pavetta became a storm. The court that had dismissed her as a decorative princess discovered she could kill them all if she lost control. Geralt and Mousesack, the druid present as advisor to Skellige's delegation, worked together to calm her. The magic subsided. The hall fell silent except for the sounds of damage and groaning. And in that silence, Calanthe reconsidered. A queen weighed options. Her daughter possessed power that could destroy kingdoms. That same daughter loved the cursed man standing in the wreckage. The law of surprise bound them regardless of what Calanthe preferred. Fighting this would cost more than accepting it. Perhaps more importantly, Calanthe recognized something in Duny's eyes. He had known the risk. He had come anyway. That suggested either foolishness or desperation, possibly both, but it also suggested commitment. This was not a man who would abandon Pavetta when political winds shifted. Calanthe agreed to the marriage, not graciously, not with approval, but she agreed. Midnight came. The curse, bound to Duny since childhood, finally broke. The transformation that had defined his existence for years simply stopped. He stood before the court as a man, not monstrous, not cursed, human. Pavetta had loved him truly enough that the old magic recognized it. The spell released him. They married. That same night, in the aftermath of chaos and revelation, they spoke vows. And in the morning, when servants were still cleaning the hall, and nobles were still processing what they had witnessed, Mousesack announced something else. Pavetta was pregnant. The child had likely been conceived during those secret midnight meetings. Duny was not just a husband. He was about to be a father. Geralt, present through all of this, made a decision he would question for the rest of his life. He invoked the law of surprise on Duny, payment for services rendered for defending him during the banquet. The formula was spoken. The binding took effect. Whatever Duny found at home that he did not expect now belonged to Geralt. Ciri, the child who would be born from that union in late 1252, the girl who would carry elder blood and tear holes in reality. She was Geralt's child of destiny before she was even born. Duny settled into life in Cintra. He took the title of prince through his marriage. He lived in the palace, subject to Calanthe's watchful governance, but granted a role. The years that followed were, by all external accounts, peaceful. He and Pavetta raised Ciri. They participated in court functions. They appeared to be what they claimed, a noble couple living the life that nobility provided. But Duny was not who he claimed to be. He was Emhyr var Emreis, rightful Emperor of Nilfgaard, heir to the throne the usurper had stolen. He had not forgotten this. He had not abandoned his claim. He had simply been waiting, as he had waited in exile, as he had waited through the cursed years, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the pieces to align. Then Vilgefortz arrived. Then prophecy entered the equation. Then Emhyr learned what his daughter represented. The Prophecy of Ithlinne spoke of elder blood. It spoke of a child who would inherit power to reshape reality. It spoke of endings and beginnings, of the world's fate bound to bloodlines that reached back to the elves who first came to this world. Ciri carried that blood. Ciri was that child. And if Emhyr could control her, could guide what that power became, could ensure it served his purposes, the calculation was brutal in its simplicity. Return to Nilfgaard, reclaim the throne, bring Ciri with him, raise her to understand her role, and when she was old enough, when the time was right, fulfill the next part of the prophecy. The child of elder blood, combined with imperial power, would produce an heir capable of ruling not just an empire, but the world itself. It required one thing: marrying his own daughter. Emhyr understood the monstrosity of this. He was not mad. He was not delusional. He knew exactly what he was planning, but he had been taught, in a room where they tortured him at 13, that what mattered was the outcome. His father had chosen principle over his son's immediate safety. Emhyr would choose the world's future over his daughter's freedom. The arithmetic was the same. Sacrifice the smaller thing to preserve the larger. He began planning the escape from Cintra. Vilgefortz would help. The ship would sail across the Sedna Abyss. They would fake their deaths, his, Pavetta's, and Ciri's, so that Nilfgaard believed its rightful heir was returning without baggage, without complications. Then Emhyr would retake the throne. Then the real work would begin. Pavetta discovered the plan. Exactly how remained uncertain. Perhaps she found documents. Perhaps she overheard conversations. Perhaps she simply knew Duny well enough to recognize when he was hiding something. However it occurred, she learned what her husband intended. She learned he meant to take Ciri to Nilfgaard. She learned the marriage had been, if not entirely false, at least more complicated than she had believed. She did what any mother would do. She saved her child. She arranged for Ciri to be left behind in Cintra, smuggled off the ship before it sailed. Then she confronted Duny about what she had done. They argued. On the ship, in the middle of the Sedna Abyss, they fought about their daughter and destiny, and whether prophecy justified what Emhyr intended. The accounts that survived suggested it ended with Pavetta falling overboard. Whether she fell or whether he pushed her, whether it was accident or murder, became a question without definitive answer. Emhyr claimed she fell. Geralt, years later, when the truth emerged, suggested otherwise. Pavetta drowned in the Sedna Abyss, and Duny was the only witness. Vilgefortz, waiting at the arranged location, transported only Emhyr back to Nilfgaard. The plan had collapsed. Pavetta was dead. Ciri was still in Cintra. The carefully constructed escape had failed in every way that mattered. Except one, Duny was free to return to his homeland. Free to shed the identity he had worn for 15 years. Free to become Emhyr var Emreis again. The boy who had been tortured at 13, who had survived as a cursed beast, who had loved a woman and killed her, arrived in Nilfgaard and began the work of reclaiming his birthright. The usurper had ruled for years. He had grown comfortable. He didn't see the threat until it was already inside his court, until the rightful heir had gathered enough support to move. The coup that followed mirrored the one that had taken Fergus's throne. Emhyr had learned those lessons well. He knew how coups functioned. He knew what they required. When he moved decisively. The usurper fell. The throne was reclaimed, and Emhyr var Emreis, who had spent his childhood as a prince, his adolescence as a monster, and his early adulthood as Duny, finally became what he was born to be, Emperor of Nilfgaard, the White Flame, dancing on the Barrows of His Enemies, the man who would hunt his daughter across a continent because prophecy demanded it. The Hedgehog's gambit had succeeded. He had won Pavetta. He had broken his curse. He had fathered the child who carried elder blood. He had reclaimed his throne. Everything had worked exactly as planned, except the part where his wife drowned, except the part where his daughter remained beyond his reach, except the part where love, which had seemed so useful for breaking curses, proved insufficient for what came after. Those were the costs. Those were the prices paid. And Emhyr, standing in the palace of Nilfgaard with his political enemies being disinterred so their tombstones could pave his ballroom floor, accepted those costs. He had learned acceptance in that torture chamber. He had learned that pain was simply a thing that happened, that consequences were simply outcomes of choices. He had made his choices. The consequences would follow, and he would pursue them with the same cold determination that had carried him from childhood to exile, to curse to crown. The Empire waited. The wars waited. The hunt for Ciri waited. Everything that followed came from the choices made here, in Cintra, when a cursed man had invoked ancient law and won a princess and lost something he could not name. Pratkut. Prophecy was a weapon that pointed in all directions. Ithlinne Evenien had lived centuries before Emhyr was born. She had been a seer among the elves, one who spoke what she claimed were visions of the future. Her words were recorded, preserved, studied by those who believed the future could be known. Among her prophecies was one that spoke of elder blood, of a child who would inherit power to reshape the world, of endings and beginnings bound together in bloodlines that reached back to when elves first arrived on the continent. The prophecy was specific enough to be dangerous and vague enough to be interpreted. It spoke of the world ending in ice, of the elder blood standing between survival and extinction. It suggested that a child born of that bloodline, combined with proper authority, would produce an heir capable of ruling not just territories but reality itself. Whether this was literal truth or metaphorical vision, whether Ithlinne had truly seen the future or had simply woven impressive words, remained unknowable. But those who believed treated the prophecy as fact, and those who believed made decisions based on that conviction. Vilgefortz believed. The mage who appeared before Duny in Cintra, who spoke of destiny and power, who outlined what Ciri represented. He believed with a certainty of someone who had studied the texts, who had traced the bloodlines, who had identified Pavetta and her daughter as carriers of what the prophecy required. He laid out the vision. He explained what could be achieved. He offered to help Emhyr reclaim his throne in Nilfgaard. In exchange, he wanted access to what elder blood could accomplish. Emhyr listened. He had learned, in his years of survival, to recognize opportunity when it presented itself. The prophecy offered justification for what he already wanted: his throne, his empire, his rightful place. If that path also led to power beyond what emperors typically wielded, if it offered a chance to shape the world rather than simply govern portions of it, that was not something to dismiss. But the prophecy came with requirements that, once spoken aloud, could not be unheard. The child of elder blood, combined with imperial authority, would produce the heir the prophecy foretold. Ciri carried the blood. Emhyr held, or would hold, the authority. But bloodlines required reproduction. The prophecy's fulfillment required a child born of both elements. Emhyr was Ciri's father. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and unavoidable. To fulfill what Vilgefortz claimed destiny demanded, Emhyr would need to marry his daughter. He would need to father a child with her. He would need to transform her from daughter into wife, from child into vessel for prophecy's purposes. The plan was monstrous. It was also, according to the prophecy's interpreters, necessary. Emhyr made his calculation, the same calculation he had been taught to make when they tortured him at 13, when they showed him that choosing right from wrong was less important than choosing survival from destruction. If the prophecy was true, if the world would end in ice and only elder blood combined with imperial power could prevent that ending, then one girl's suffering was mathematically insignificant against the lives of everyone who would die otherwise. He had learned this arithmetic in pain. He applied it in planning. Everything that followed, the attempt to bring Ciri to Nilfgaard, the plan to fake their deaths, the betrayal of Pavetta, who recognized what he intended, all of it came from accepting what the prophecy demanded and deciding that demand was more important than humanity. Pavetta had disagreed. She had smuggled Ciri off the ship, had chosen her daughter's freedom over her husband's vision. The argument that followed ended with Pavetta in the sea and Emhyr alone, returning to Nilfgaard with his plans in ruins, and his wife drowned by his hand or by accident. The distinction mattered less than the outcome. Pavetta was gone. Ciri was beyond his reach. The prophecy remained unfulfilled, but Emhyr did not abandon the goal. He simply adjusted the strategy. Reclaiming the throne came first. The usurper had ruled for years, had grown comfortable in power that did not belong to him. Emhyr returned to Nilfgaard in secret, using contacts Vilgefortz provided, rebuilding networks of loyalty that his father had once commanded. He was patient. He had learned patience in exile. He gathered support slowly, carefully, ensuring that when he moved, the movement would be decisive. The usurper fell in 1257. The manner of his death was not preserved in official histories. What mattered was the result. Emhyr var Emreis sat on the throne his father had occupied, in the palace where he had been tortured, ruling the empire that had been stolen. He was 28 years old. He had spent half his life in exile, cursed, hiding. Now he had reclaimed what was his by right of birth. The first thing he did was order the graves of his political enemies opened. Those who had supported the usurper, those who had participated in the coup, those who had benefited from his father's death, their burial sites were excavated. The tombstones were removed, and those stones were brought to the palace and laid as flooring in the grand ballroom. When Emhyr walked through that hall, when he hosted functions there, he walked over the markers of those who had opposed him. The message was clear. The dead would serve his purposes even if the living had not. This was how he became known as Ithlinne Adden, Yin Karn Iap Morvud, the White Flame, dancing on the Barrows of His Enemies. The title was his own design. He had made it literal. He had transformed metaphor into architecture. Those who came to petition the emperor, who processed through that ballroom seeking favor or delivering tribute, learned what happened to those who stood against him. The lesson did not require explanation. The stones taught it with every step. Then he began building the intelligence apparatus that would consume 3 times the budget of education and culture combined. Information was power. Knowing where Ciri was, who protected her, What she was learning, that mattered more than art or scholarship. The network spread throughout the empire first, then extended into the north. Servants were recruited, merchants were employed, minor nobles were cultivated. Each provided fragments. Combined, those fragments formed pictures, and those pictures guided strategy. The First Northern War began in 1263. The official justification spoke of Nilfgaard's destiny to unite the continent, of bringing civilization to kingdoms that squabbled among themselves, of ending the wars between Redania and Temeria and Cadwin by subsuming them all under imperial authority. The real motivation was simpler. Cintra held Ciri. Queen Calanthe guarded her granddaughter with obsessive care. The only way to reach the girl was through conquest. The war went well initially. Nilfgaardian forces were disciplined, well supplied, coordinated in ways northern armies were not. They took territory efficiently. They reached Cintra. The siege was brief. Calanthe, seeing defeat approaching, made her choice. She threw herself from the palace tower rather than surrender. The lioness of Cintra died on stone below her own castle. The city fell hours later, but Ciri escaped. Cahir Mar Dyfrin Ep Chelak, the knight Emhyr had assigned specifically to retrieve her, failed. The girl vanished into the chaos of the siege. She was somewhere in the north, alive but beyond reach. The war had achieved its goal and simultaneously failed. Cintra was conquered. Ciri was gone. Emhyr adjusted. He always adjusted. The war continued, ostensibly for the reasons stated publicly. Armies moved north, territories were occupied. The northern kingdoms, finally understanding the threat, united against Nilfgaard in ways they never had when fighting each other. The momentum shifted. Emhyr, recognizing that maintaining conquered territory would cost more than it returned, negotiated peace. The north called it victory. Emhyr called it acceptable outcome. He had learned what he needed about northern defenses, about which kingdoms would ally under pressure, about how to approach the next attempt. The search for Ciri never stopped. Knights were dispatched. Mages were employed. The intelligence network devoted substantial resources to tracking a single teenage girl. Reports arrived regularly. She was in Cadwin. She was in Temeria. She was with a witcher. She was training. She was learning to use her power. Each report refined Emhyr's understanding. Each sighting adjusted the strategy. But as years passed without capturing her, Emhyr recognized a problem. The Empire needed to believe Ciri was already in Nilfgaardian custody. Cintra's conquest would be more legitimate if the princess had been secured. The northern kingdoms would be less likely to rally around her as a symbol if they believed she was already lost. So Emhyr created a solution. False Ciri, a girl taken from a noble family, chosen because she resembled the real princess closely enough that those who did not know Ciri personally would accept the substitution. This girl was trained, coached, given the role of her life. She would pretend to be Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon. She would appear in public as Emhyr's ward, later as his intended. She would legitimize Nilfgaard's claim to Cintra simply by existing and accepting that claim. The girl performed her role adequately. Emhyr treated her with kindness, not because he felt kindness, but because a well-treated prisoner was more convincing than a frightened one. She lived in the palace. She wore fine clothes. She was taught proper court behavior. And in public, she smiled and acted as though being the emperor's captive bride was an honor. The deception worked. Most who saw her believed. The northern kingdom's hope that Ciri might return to reclaim Cintra faded. The girl in Nilfgaard wore the right face and said the right words. In 1268, Emhyr married False Ciri. The ceremony was elaborate, public, designed to demonstrate Nilfgaard's complete control over Cintra's legacy. The girl became queen in name, though power remained entirely Emhyr's. The marriage was political theater. It was also preparation. When the real Ciri was eventually captured, the mechanisms would already be in place. The empire would be accustomed to the emperor marrying the princess of Cintra. Transitioning from the false version to the real one would be simpler if precedent existed. The Second Northern War began in the late 1260s. The justifications were similar to the first. The actual goal remained unchanged: locate and capture Ciri. The war provided cover for having forces throughout the north, for maintaining the intelligence network's operations, for explaining why Nilfgaardian knights appeared in unlikely places asking questions about a girl with ashen hair. This war went less well than the first. The North had learned from previous mistakes. Their alliances were stronger. Their strategies had adapted to Nilfgaardian tactics. The fighting dragged through seasons. Casualties mounted. The treasury that Emhyr had carefully managed was depleted, funding campaigns that produced marginal gains. The Empire, which had supported the First Northern War with enthusiasm, began questioning whether endless conquests served their interests. Emhyr faced something he had not encountered since reclaiming the throne: meaningful opposition from within Nilfgaard itself. Not open rebellion. Not coup attempts like the one that had taken his father's life, but quiet resistance. Nobles who questioned the war's purpose, generals who suggested defensive strategies rather than offensive ones, merchants who complained about taxes. The aristocracy, which had benefited from the First Northern War's success, found themselves bearing the costs of the Second without seeing corresponding rewards. Yet Emhyr persisted. He persisted because the prophecy demanded it. He persisted because finding Ciri remained the central imperative regardless of what it cost. He had spent his entire life pursuing this goal, first unknowingly when he invoked the law of surprise, then consciously when Vilgefortz revealed what Ciri represented, then obsessively after Pavetta took her out of reach. Everything else was mechanism. Everything else could be sacrificed. The war eventually ended without clear victory for either side. Territories changed hands, borders shifted, thousands died, and Ciri remained uncaptured. She was somewhere in the north. She was training with the Witcher. She was learning what her power could do. The intelligence network tracked her movements but could never quite reach her. She stayed ahead of his hunters, whether through luck or skill or destiny's own protection. Emhyr adjusted again. The war had failed to deliver what mattered, but it had revealed something important. Ciri would not be taken by force alone. She was too powerful, too mobile, too protected by circumstances that resembled fate itself. A different approach was needed, perhaps negotiation, perhaps offering her something she wanted in exchange for cooperation, perhaps appealing to her as a father rather than an emperor. This last possibility disturbed him when he acknowledged it. The boy who had been tortured at 13, who had learned that emotion was weakness, who had killed his wife because she stood between him and necessity, that person had no business attempting fatherhood. Yet prophecy demanded results. If gentleness worked where force had failed, he would attempt gentleness. He would wear whatever mask the situation required. In the years that followed the book's ending, Emhyr finally met with Ciri directly. The reunion was controlled, careful, weighted with everything unspoken between them. He explained that she was in danger, that her surrogate parents could not protect her alone, that he wanted to help. Whether this was true or whether it was another strategy remained ambiguous even within the meeting itself. Emhyr was capable of genuine concern. He was also capable of weaponizing that concern. The monstrous plan, marrying Ciri, fathering a child with her, existed in the background of every interaction. The answer to whether this would come to pass lived in places no one could see, in decisions that had not yet been made, in futures that had not yet arrived. In the books, the plan eventually failed. Emhyr confronted Ciri at the end of the saga. He saw her face to face. He spoke with her, and he could not do what the prophecy demanded. Whether this was growth, whether this was the father finally overcoming the emperor, whether this was simply tactical recognition that she would kill him if he tried, the text left it ambiguous. He let her go. He chose her freedom over the prophecy's promise. But that decision came only after years of hunting her. Only after 2 wars. Only after thousands dead in pursuit of a goal he could never speak aloud. The redemption, if it was redemption, came late. Too late for Pavetta, too late for the dead on battlefields, too late to undo what he had become in service of what he believed was necessary. Prophecy had poisoned everything. It had transformed a father's potential love into a hunter's obsession. It had made a daughter into a prize to be captured. It had turned family into political calculation, and marriage into apocalypse prevention. Vilgefortz had brought the words. Emhyr had believed them, and belief had consequences that reshaped the continent. Whether the prophecy was true, whether the elder bloodchild would actually rule the world, whether any of it would have worked, these questions had no answers. Prophecy was unfalsifiable. It promised a future that might arrive or might not, and those who believed adjusted the present based on that promised future. Emhyr had sacrificed everything to fulfill words spoken by a dead elf about events that had not occurred. He had trusted prophecy more than he trusted his own capacity for love. This was the poison. Not that the prophecy was wrong, but that believing it required becoming someone capable of implementing its requirements. Emhyr had been that someone. He had been shaped by torture and curse and exile into someone who could look at monstrosity and call it necessity. Prophecy had simply given that capacity direction. The empire he built, the wars he fought, the gravestones he walked over, all of it served the singular vision of forcing the future into alignment with words spoken centuries ago. Whether history would vindicate him depended entirely on whether the prophecy's warnings about the end of the world proved accurate. If ice came and elder blood was needed to stop it, he would be remembered as the emperor who understood necessity. If the warnings were false, if the prophecy was misinterpretation or manipulation, he would be remembered simply as the man who hunted his daughter and called it salvation. The judgment was not yet rendered. The future remained unwritten, but the choices were made. The consequences were set in motion. And Emhyr var Emreis, sitting in his palace with his false queen, and his intelligence reports and his ballroom of tombstones, waited for history to decide whether he was prophet or monster. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps the distinction was meaningless. Perhaps what mattered was not the category but the recognition that prophecy, once believed, transformed believers into instruments of its own fulfillment. Emhyr had become that instrument. He had accepted what it required, and now he would live with what that acceptance had cost. Power accumulated consequences the way bodies accumulated scars. Emhyr var Emreis had learned this through direct experience. Each decision left a mark. Each choice created weight that persisted regardless of outcome. The boy, tortured at 13, carried those hours forever. The cursed beast who survived in exile carried those years. The husband who killed his wife carried that moment. The emperor who hunted his daughter carried that hunt. None of it could be set aside. None of it faded simply because new problems demanded attention. The past was architecture. Everything built on top of it. By the late 1260s, the empire stretched further than it ever had. Nilfgaard proper, yes, but also the territories absorbed during the wars. Cintra, portions of Sodden, occupied lands whose names changed depending on who drew the maps. The administration required to govern this expanse was vast. Roads needed maintenance. Grain needed transportation. Taxes needed collection. Disputes needed resolution. An empire was not simply military force. It was bureaucracy functioning at scale. Thousands of small decisions combining into something that resembled coherent policy. Emhyr was exceptionally good at this. He understood systems. He understood how to identify capable administrators and place them where they would function best. He understood that governing was not about making every decision personally, but about creating structures that made the right decisions likely. The empire ran efficiently because he had built it to run efficiently. That was his talent. Not warfare, not diplomacy, not charisma. Administration. Making complex systems function. But efficient systems served their designers' purposes, and Emhyr's purposes were not what most of his subjects believed. The official history spoke of Nilfgaard's destiny to unite the continent, to bring order to kingdoms that squabbled among themselves, to create a lasting peace through imperial authority. The reality was narrower and more disturbing. Everything served the search for Ciri. Everything else was justification after the fact. The wars had been cover for the hunt. The occupation of Cintra had been an attempt to secure her directly. The intelligence network's enormous budget existed primarily to track one girl. The Second Northern War, which had cost thousands of lives and depleted the treasury, had been launched because reports suggested she was in Cadwyn and could be captured if sufficient forces were present. When those reports proved inaccurate, when Ciri remained beyond reach, the war continued anyway, because withdrawing without her would mean admitting the entire enterprise had failed. This was the secret that Emhyr could never speak aloud. The aristocracy believed they were building an empire. The generals believed they were securing Nilfgaard's dominance. The common people believed they were sacrificing for glory. None of them knew that the emperor was pursuing his daughter for purposes that would disgust them if they understood. The prophecy, the plan to marry her, the child that would supposedly rule the world, these remained locked behind Emhyr's unchanging expression. He gave orders. He issued explanations that satisfied without revealing. He governed through silence about what actually mattered. The cost of this deception was mounting. The aristocracy, which had supported the First Northern War enthusiastically, had grown skeptical. The Second Northern War had dragged through years without producing clear gains. Resources that should have enriched Nilfgaard's nobles instead funded campaigns that benefited the emperor's unstated goals. Resentment built in the places power forgot to watch. Not open rebellion, nothing so crude, but quiet conversations in halls where informants might not hear. Speculation about why the emperor seemed obsessed with a single northern girl. Questions about whether the war served the empire or served something else entirely. Emhyr's intelligence network reported these murmurings. He read the reports carefully. He recognized that support was eroding, but he did not adjust course. He could not. The prophecy demanded Ciri. Everything else was negotiable. If the aristocracy needed to be managed they would be. If resentment needed to be addressed, he would address it. But the central objective remained fixed. Finding Ciri, securing her cooperation or compliance, fulfilling what Ithlinne had foretold, this was the foundation everything else was built on. The marriage to False Ciri had been part of managing perception. The empire needed to believe the goal was achieved, that Cintra's princess was safely in Nilfgaardian custody, that the emperor's interest in her was political rather than prophetic. The girl performed her role adequately. She appeared in public. She smiled at appropriate moments. She was gracious and beautiful, and everything a captured princess was supposed to be. Most believed the deception. Those few who suspected said nothing. Accusing the emperor of maintaining an impostor required evidence and, more importantly, required being willing to voice such an accusation. Few possessed that courage. Emhyr treated False Ciri with calculated kindness. He gave her comfortable quarters. He ensured she was well-dressed and well-fed. He spoke to her with courtesy. This was not affection. It was recognition that a content prisoner was more useful than a broken one. She needed to be convincing. Convincing required believing, at least partially, that her situation was acceptable. So he made it acceptable. He gave her enough freedom that she could pretend she had chosen this. The pretense served both of them, but the real Ciri remained beyond his reach. Reports arrived regularly. She was with the Witcher Geralt. She was training. She was learning to use her power. She had been seen in various locations across the north. Each report was investigated. Each sighting triggered responses. Knights were dispatched. Mages were consulted. The search continued with resources that could have built schools or roads or hospitals. Instead, they built the machinery of pursuit. Cahir had failed repeatedly. The knight was capable, loyal, dedicated to his emperor's service, but capability was insufficient against what Ciri had become. She was no longer the child who had fled Cintra. She had trained with witchers. She had learned to fight. More importantly, she had begun understanding her power. The elder blood was not simply lineage. It was ability. She could move between worlds, could tear holes in reality, could access power that made conventional force irrelevant. Capturing someone like that required more than knights and strategy. Stefan Skellen took over when Cahir's failures became unsustainable. Skellen was different, more ruthless, more willing to employ methods that Cahir's honor would not permit. He was effective in ways that made Emhyr uncomfortable, not because Emhyr opposed ruthlessness. He had killed his wife, had launched wars, had built an empire on calculating cruelty, but because Skellen's effectiveness came from recognizing what Emhyr truly wanted and being willing to provide it regardless of consequence. That kind of loyalty was dangerous. It meant Skellen understood the unspoken plan. It meant someone else knew. Yet, Emhyr employed him. Anyway, results mattered more than comfort. If Skellen could deliver Ciri when others had failed, the discomfort was acceptable. The risk was acceptable. Everything was acceptable if it served the goal. The goal itself was changing, though Emhyr did not acknowledge this openly. The prophecy had promised that a child born of elder blood, combined with imperial authority, would rule the world. Emhyr had believed this completely when Vilgefortz first explained it, but years of pursuing Ciri, years of watching her evade every trap, years of recognizing that she was not simply a vessel, but a person with her own power and her own will. These years had complicated the simple calculations. She would not cooperate willingly. That much was clear. Even if captured, even if brought to Nilfgaard, she would resist what the prophecy required. Forcing her would be possible. Emhyr had the authority, had the power to compel compliance, but force introduced variables. A child born from rape, from captivity, from a mother who hated the father, that child would inherit more than elder blood. That child would inherit trauma and rage and justification for destroying everything Emhyr had built. Perhaps more troubling, Emhyr was uncertain he could force it, not because of physical impossibility, because when he imagined confronting Ciri directly, when he imagined explaining what prophecy demanded, when he imagined seeing his daughter's face as she understood what he intended, something in him hesitated. This was new. Hesitation was not something Emhyr permitted himself, but it appeared regardless. The father, subordinated for years to the emperor's purposes, was becoming harder to ignore. In the years that followed, when Emhyr finally met Ciri, when he saw what she had become, he let her go. This could be seen as character growth, as the emperor discovering he had limits after all. But the truth suggested something more complex. Perhaps he recognized that forcing the prophecy would destroy everything it promised to create. Perhaps he understood that some prices were too high, even for him. Perhaps he simply acknowledged that destiny, which had seemed so clear when Vilgefortz explained it, was more complicated when it stood before him with his daughter's face. Or perhaps he was simply exhausted. Decades of pursuit. 2 wars fought primarily as cover for his search. A wife dead. An empire that resented him more with each passing year. Thousands of casualties. An intelligence network that consumed resources without delivering the one result that mattered. At some point, the question became not, can this goal be achieved, but is achieving it worth what it requires? Emhyr never explicitly stated this question. He was not given to such admissions, but his actions in the saga's conclusion suggested he had asked it privately. He let Ciri go. He did not pursue her further. He withdrew his forces. He negotiated peace with the North on terms less favorable than he could have demanded. These were not the actions of someone still committed to prophecy's fulfillment at any cost. These were the actions of someone who had reached a limit. Whether that limit was moral or practical remained unclear. Emhyr was capable of morality. He had demonstrated kindness when it suited his purposes. He had shown restraint when force would have been counterproductive. But he had also demonstrated willingness to discard morality when goals required it. So perhaps the limit was not conscience awakening, but simply recognition that the plan had become impossible. Ciri could not be forced. Prophecy could not be fulfilled. The future would arrive without the guidance Ithlinne had promised. Accepting this was not redemption. It was acknowledgement of reality. The empire would continue regardless. Nilfgaard would persist with or without Emhyr. His reign would eventually end. Death came even for emperors, and someone else would sit on the throne he had reclaimed. The ballroom floor would still bear the names of his enemies. The bureaucracy he had built would still function. The wars he had fought would still mark the continent's history. But the central purpose, the driving obsession that had defined his rule, would remain unfulfilled. This was perhaps the truest measure of what he had become. He had sacrificed everything: family, morality, the empire's resources, thousands of lives, pursuing a goal that ultimately proved unreachable. Not because he was defeated, because what he was attempting required transforming his daughter into something she would never accept becoming. The prophecy could only be fulfilled if Ciri cooperated. She would not. He could not force her without destroying what the prophecy promised to create. The circle had no exit, so he danced on gravestones and read intelligence reports and issued orders that moved armies and governed an empire that stretched across half the known world. He did this because it was what emperors did, because stopping would mean acknowledging that everything had been for nothing, because continuing at least maintained the appearance that purpose remained. The white flame still burned. Whether it lit the path forward or simply consumed what remained was a question he did not ask aloud. The choices that rerouted continents came from moments most would consider small. A 13-year-old boy in a torture chamber who learned that pain could be endured. A cursed beast who saved a king and invoked ancient law. A husband who learned of prophecy and chose ambition over family. An emperor who built an intelligence network and launched wars and married a false queen and hunted his daughter across years. Each moment seemed logical in isolation. Each decision followed from what preceded it. Together, they formed a path that led from childhood to empire to the recognition that some destinations could not be reached. What Emhyr never said aloud was simpler than prophecy, darker than ambition, more human than the white. Flame's reputation suggested. He had wanted to matter. He had wanted his suffering to produce meaning rather than simply pain. The torture at 13, the years as a monster, the exile and survival and curse, all of it needed to mean something beyond arbitrary cruelty. Prophecy had offered that meaning. It had suggested that his daughter's power, combined with his authority, could save the world. It had given purpose to everything he had endured, but purpose was not justification. Meaning was not permission. The world did not owe him redemption for suffering, and suffering did not excuse what he had done in suffering's name. These were truths he understood but could not speak. They existed beneath the emperor's mask, in the space between the boy who was tortured and the man who danced on graves. They were the weight of crowns, the price of power, the cost of believing that destiny justified anything. The empire's appetite had consumed much: territory, lives, resources, loyalty, trust, love. The list continued without obvious end. What it had not consumed was the hunger itself. That persisted. That would persist until Emhyr died, or until he finally accepted that some hungers could not be satisfied. Neither seemed imminent, so he continued. The white flame danced. The gravestones bore their names. The intelligence reports arrived with their endless variations of the same message. Ciri was still beyond reach. And in the silence between orders, in the moments when even emperors were briefly alone, perhaps Emhyr thought about what he had never said. Never to Pavetta before she drowned. Never to Ciri in the rare moments they met. Never to himself in the decades since the torture chamber. The words that might have changed everything if spoken, that might have created different paths, that might have suggested that suffering did not have to produce monsters, but those words remained unspoken. Silence was safer. Silence was what he knew. Silence was the white flame's truest weapon. What could not be voiced could not be used against him. What was never said could never be disproven. So he governed in silence, pursued his goals in silence, danced on stones that bore his enemies' names without speaking what he truly wanted, what he truly feared, what he might have become if that room at 13 had never existed. The long shadow covered continents. The choices echoed through generations. The silence persisted, and the boy who burned became the emperor who endured, who ruled, who shaped history without ever quite escaping what history had done to him. This was Emhyr var Emreis. Ithlinne Adin, in Carn ep Morvud, the white flame dancing on the barrows of his enemies. Emperor, father, hunter, monster, man. All of these. None of these completely. Something more complex than categories allowed. Something that required looking at every piece to understand any piece. Something that could not be summarized without losing the truth. The ballroom floor bore names. The emperor walked over them. The dance continued, and what was never said remained the loudest sound of all. For those who seek to understand the forces that shape the continent, the stories continue. Share this knowledge with others who value the truths that history preserves.